The camera was rolling. But as Traoré spoke about betrayal, Leonardo's hands began to shake. And when it came time to ask the final question, he couldn't find the strength to speak. The sun was unforgiving that afternoon in Ouagadougou. The kind of heat that didn't just scorch skin, it stripped away everything unnecessary. It made you raw, real. And for the first time in a long time, Leonardo DiCaprio wasn't thinking about lighting or framing. He was thinking about silence. A different kind of silence, the one that follows truth. He stood outside the modest building with his film crew, their equipment cases piled like bricks beside a metal door. This wasn't some UN press setup. There were no handlers, no PR teams, no soft background music. Just him and the weight of a conversation he didn't know how to have. 3 months earlier, Leonardo had begun production on a documentary called The Forgotten Lungs of Earth. It was meant to expose how global powers were exploiting climate narratives while silencing the very voices of those fighting on the front lines. And at the heart of that idea, one man kept surfacing, Ibrahim Traoré. Every attempt to contact him had failed. Emails, letters through UN channels, through African Union contacts, through mutual friends in the environmental space. Nothing. Until a single envelope arrived at Leo's hotel room 2 nights ago. No name, no return address. Just one handwritten sentence inside. If you still want the truth, come alone. He didn't sleep after that. And now, here he was, sweating, heart pounding, wondering if this was even real. The door opened. Slowly, a tall man in a worn military shirt looked him up and down. No words, just a nod. Leonardo stepped inside. The room was shockingly bare. No decorations, one wooden table, 2 metal chairs, a dusty ceiling fan that didn't spin. His crew hesitated behind him, unsure if they should follow. The guard nodded again. They set up the camera equipment quickly, quietly like students who knew they weren't in charge here. Then, the door opened again. Traoré entered with the kind of presence that made you forget how young he actually was. He wore no medals, no suit, just a plain green tunic and sandals. He didn't shake Leo's hand. He didn't smile for the camera. He just looked directly at him as if seeing the entire man, not the actor. Leonardo extended his hand awkwardly. "I really appreciate you doing this," he said softly. Traoré looked at the hand, then took it. Firm, brief. "I only agreed to this because I watched your earlier films," Traoré said. "The ones before the awards, when you were still angry." Leo blinked. He wasn't expecting that. He looked at his crew. The cameraman gave a small nod. They were rolling. He cleared his throat and began. "President Traoré, thank you for meeting with us today. The world knows you as a revolutionary, a protector, a threat, depending on who's watching. But I want to begin with something simple. Before politics, before power, who were you?" A long pause. Traoré leaned back. "I was a boy watching my people dig holes for others to grow rich. That's who I was. No change in tone. Number. Dramatics. Just a flat, unshakable truth." Leonardo nodded, jotting notes, but his hand already felt heavier than usual. He asked the next question about the climate crisis and Africa's role in the global system. Traoré answered simply, even when the topics got complex. He didn't speak like a politician. He didn't dodge. But something about the way he looked at Leonardo between answers, it felt like he was seeing more than the questions. "You once said in a speech," Leo continued, "that Africa is not poor, it is robbed. Do you believe the West is still doing that through climate policy?" Traoré tilted his head. "I believe the West sells guilt as if it were gold," he said. They cry about melting ice while burying our minerals in silence. You don't change a system by cleaning its face. Leonardo swallowed. He wasn't used to being this quiet during interviews. And what do you want from people like me? He asked. From Hollywood? From celebrities who try to raise awareness? Traoré didn't smile. I don't want anything, he replied. But I wonder, when was the last time you told the truth without a lens in your face? The room fell still. Even the fan had stopped turning. Leo felt his stomach drop, but kept the conversation moving. He brought up carbon markets, broken treaties, deforestation data, but the air had changed. Every question now felt like a shadow of the one he was avoiding. Finally, he reached the final card in his notebook. It was the question his team had debated asking at all, the one about personal guilt, about how it felt to fight for justice from inside the machine that built your fame. But his fingers froze. The words blurred. He looked up and Traoré was already watching him. You don't have to ask it, Traoré said gently. You already know the answer. And that's when it happened. Leonardo's voice cracked. He looked away. He tried to speak, but no words came. The crew didn't know whether to cut. The silence grew thicker, but Traoré didn't press him. He just waited. Leonardo took a long, shaking breath, then looked back at him. Why does this feel like the first real conversation I've had in years? Traoré's response was barely above a whisper. Because for once, no one here is pretending. The room remained still too still. No one dared move. Even the camera crew, used to chaos and retakes, stood frozen behind their equipment, hands resting gently on the controls, as if afraid that any sudden motion might shatter the fragile atmosphere. Hanging between the two men, Leonardo leaned forward, elbows on the table, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't trying to act. He wasn't trying to direct the moment. He wasn't even trying to ask anything anymore. He was simply present. And that, somehow, seemed to change everything. Traoré broke the silence, not with a speech, not with blame, but with a story. I was 13, he began quietly, when I first saw a man die over lithium. Leonardo blinked. The shift in tone and depth was immediate. They told. It was an accident, a collapse in the earth. But I had seen the man the day before digging with a broken shovel and a bleeding hand. The hole wasn't the problem. The silence around it was. He glanced at Leo. That's what power is, he said. Not guns. Not money. It's who gets to decide what silence means. Leonardo exhaled, barely realizing he'd been holding his breath. Do you ever get tired? He asked. Carrying this weight, this history? Traoré's expression didn't change. I don't carry it, he replied. It carries me. That answer hit Leo harder than he expected. He looked down at his hands. The same hands that had held Oscars. The same hands that had shaken. The hands of presidents and CEOs. And yet, in this moment, they felt useless. I thought I understood justice, Leo said, almost to himself. I thought by telling the stories, making the films, showing the pain. I was doing my part. Traoré nodded slowly. You were, he said. But pain shown without transformation becomes entertainment. And too often, your world sells pain to feel less guilty. Leo winced. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. But I believed in it, Leo whispered. I still do. I know, Traoré said, this time softer. That's why I let you in. A long silence followed. This one felt different. Not awkward. Sacred. Leo sat back, rubbing his eyes. His voice had steadied now, but the emotional damage had been done. There was no going back to the script. No returning to the safety of talking points. "Do you trust the West?" he finally asked. Traoré didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the room at the peeling walls, the dusty floor, the camera blinking in the corner. "I trust the land," he said. "I trust the people. But the West? It trusts only itself. Until that changes, trust will always be a one-way road." Leo nodded. He was silent for a moment before whispering, "And people like me? Where do?" "We belong in this fight?" Traoré studied him. "You don't belong anywhere until you decide what you're willing to lose." The words echoed. They didn't feel like a threat. They felt like a challenge, a quiet invitation to step outside the safety of image and identity. Outside, a distant call to prayer floated on the wind. It was dusk now. The room's shadows had stretched, soft and long, across the concrete floor. One of the crew members gently signaled the time. They had already gone over the scheduled interview window. But Traoré didn't move. Neither did Leo. "I want to understand more," Leonardo said. "Not as a filmmaker, just as a man." Traoré stood up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the fading sky. "Then stay," he said. Leo looked at him, confused. "I mean it," Traoré added. "No cameras, no scripts. Number. Headlines. Stay one more day. See the people. Not just the scars." Leo hesitated. The crew exchanged glances. His assistant, waiting outside the building, would be expecting a schedule. A flight. A hotel. But none of that mattered now. He nodded slowly. "I'll stay." Traoré turned to him, and for the first time, he smiled. Just a little. And in that moment, Leonardo realized something. He hadn't come here to capture a story. He had come here to be changed by one. The interview was over, but something else had just begun. The next morning came without noise. No alarms, no calls. Just the slow hum of morning prayers rising from a nearby street and the faint clatter of tin cups against old stone. Leonardo sat on the front step of the modest guest house Traoré had arranged for him. There was no air conditioning, no mirror, no distractions. Just stillness and a notebook in his lap he hadn't touched since the interview. He hadn't slept much. His mind kept circling back to that moment Traoré asked him to stay. Not for the camera, not for a statement, just to see. Traoré arrived without an escort. No guards, just a weather backpack over one shoulder. "Come," he said. "There's someone I want you to meet." They drove in silence. The city faded behind them, its dust, its rhythm, its tension. Then came the villages. Then a school, or what used to be one. It had no roof. Just cracked walls, rusted metal desks, and fading chalk marks across what had once been a blackboard. Children ran barefoot through the rubble, laughing as if the world hadn't forgotten them. An old man stood near the edge, leaning on a stick. His eyes lit up when he saw Traoré. "This is Papa Idrissa," Traoré said. "He was my teacher before any of this." Leonardo stepped forward, shook his hand gently. "I used to teach about trees," Idrissa said with a tired smile. "Until the trees were gone." Traoré translated softly as Idrissa spoke, though Leonardo could feel the meaning even before the words. "We used to plant one tree for every child who learned to write their name," Idrissa said. "Now they know how to spell hunger before they learn hope." Leonardo felt something sting in his chest. It wasn't pity, it was shame. He looked at the children. One boy, maybe 6 or 7, stood staring at him, curious, cautious, but not afraid. Leonardo crouched down. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy didn't answer. He just placed a small, flat stone in Leonardo's hand and pointed to the sky. Traoré leaned in. "His name means the one who remembers." Leo looked at the stone. It was nothing special, just a chipped piece of earth. But in that moment, it felt like a message. They stayed for hours. No cameras. No questions. Just stories and shared silence. Before they left, Idrissa handed Leonardo a folded cloth. "For when you forget," he said. "Because the world will make you forget." That night, back in the guest house, Leo sat by the window. He opened the notebook, then closed it again. There was nothing left to write, only something left to feel. The next day, the sun broke over Ouagadougou like a slow-burning fire, casting gold across cracked walls and rusting rooftops. But inside Leonardo's room, it was quiet. He stood alone, staring at the folded cloth Idrissa had given him. He hadn't opened it yet. It lay on the table like a question he wasn't sure how to answer. The day before had changed something. In him subtly, but irreversibly. The children's eyes. The school without a roof. The laughter inside all that ruin. It had shaken him, not because he didn't care, but because he finally realized that caring wasn't enough. He checked his phone. Dozens of missed calls. Messages from producers. Headlines about him vanishing in Burkina Faso. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to respond. There was a soft knock on the door. It was Traoré. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped in and looked around, nodding at the simplicity. "You slept?" Leonardo nodded. A little. Traoré sat opposite him, his back straight, his voice calm. "There's one more thing you should see, but only if you're ready." Leonardo didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." They drove in silence again, this time further out beyond the villages, into a stretch of land scorched by drought and mining. The road was barely a road. Dust kicked up like smoke behind the tires. Eventually, they stopped. There was no village. Here, no school, no green, only a deep open wound in the earth. A former gold mine, now abandoned, but not empty. A small group of women sat by the edge, pounding stones with metal rods. Children gathered fragments in baskets. Traoré didn't speak. He let Leonardo take it in. This was promised as development. Traoré finally said, "Foreign investors, jobs, schools. They dug, they poisoned the water, then they left." Leonardo approached one of the women. Her hands were blistered, her clothes soaked in dust. But when she looked up, her eyes were strong. No begging, just presence. Traoré stood beside him. "This is what your world calls progress." Leonardo turned to him slowly. This should be seen," he said. "The whole world needs to see this." Traoré looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet warning. "They won't look," he said. "And if they do, they'll cry." And then changed the channel. Leonardo didn't reply. He couldn't. Instead, he crouched beside one of the children, maybe 9 years old, dragging a bucket full of rock chips. "Do you go to school?" Leo asked. The boy shook his head. "Do you want to?" The boy looked at him, puzzled, then pointed to the mine. Leonardo understood. "This is his school," Traoré said. "And the lesson is simple. The world only values what it can take." They stayed for a while. There was nothing to film, nothing to document, only a truth that hung in the air like dust impossible to avoid. Back in the vehicle, Leonardo was silent the entire ride. When they returned to the guest house, he walked straight to his bag, pulled out the notebook, and tore out every page. Not in anger, but in release. He picked up the folded cloth from Idrissa, and this time, he opened it. Inside was a single sentence, embroidered by hand in fading thread. If you carry only what you're proud of, you'll never be free. That night, Leonardo sat across from Traoré for the final time. The cameras were packed away. The crew, asleep. Only the two of them remained, two men from different worlds, bound now by something neither of them could fully explain. There was one last question, Leonardo said softly. I never asked it. Traoré waited. Leo's voice was barely a whisper. How do you live with all of this and not become bitter? Traoré's eyes didn't waver. Because bitterness is a cage, he said. And the people I fight for, they need me free. Leonardo nodded, his throat tight. Thank you, he said. Traoré stood. He didn't offer a speech. He didn't give advice. He simply placed a hand on Leonardo's shoulder, then walked away. Leonardo stayed seated long after he left, not as an actor, not as an activist, just as a man, finally willing to start. Again, if this story made you feel something you can't explain, you're not alone. Tap like if it moved you, and subscribe for more stories the world forgets to tell. Now tell us in the comments, when was the last time a truth changed? How you saw the world? Sometimes, the deepest truths aren't spoken on camera. They're the ones that leave you silent, long after the story ends.